Welcome, everyone, to the Huguenot Society of South Carolina. We're so pleased to be with you. My name's Elizabeth Gay, and I'm the executive director here. I'm located in Charleston, South Carolina, our headquarters. And joining us today in the Zoom is Dr. Tessa Murdock, who is situated in London today. And we're so glad to have her with us because we are going to enjoy Tessa's remarks with regard to the Society's offering of a trip to England in May of 2025. And we are very fortunate to have Tessa as one of our friends. And she has worked tirelessly with me this summer to help coordinate a lovely journey for all of us to walk in our Huguenot footsteps. Thank you for being with us, Tessa.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Elizabeth. And
We'd
I
love
am
to.
delighted to share the proposed itinerary and some of the highlights that we will be seeing during your week in London. It is a particular honor to be able to welcome members of the Huguenot Society of South Carolina to, I shall say, Huguenot London. um, so we are going to start, and let's hope this now moves forward, by visiting the Victoria and Albert Museum to see some really exceptional Huguenot silver made by first generation goldsmiths who came from the French regions for the most part. So we're looking here actually, before we go to the V&A, at the British Museum, at this wonderful ewer and dish made by Pierre Harache, who was a first generation goldsmith from Rouen, in fact, of the late 17th century refuge. He was the first goldsmith to register his mark at the Guild head office, Goldsmiths Hall in the City of London. And the coat of arms is for the Duke of Devonshire, who was one of the leading patrons of Huguenot craftsmen. And his great country seat at Chatsworth has a really remarkable collection of silver made by Pierre Harache and his contemporaries. But particularly characteristic is the shape of the ewer, which is known as a helmet shape. So if you imagine inverting it, you could possibly wear it as a hat. But anyway, it was wonderfully sculptural with this mermaid handle cast from a sculptor's model and the generous pouring lip, which would have been used to pour rose water into the basin. So you would have actually read the coat of arms through a kind of film of scented water that was used to rinse your fingers before and after the meal. So it probably would have been passed around the table, giving people the opportunity to wash their hands before and after eating. So as we walk around the British Museum, we will see this very enticing portrait of Dr. Mathieu Maty, who was in fact educated in Leiden in the Netherlands, where he studied medicine. But by the mid 18th century, he'd been appointed under librarian of the newly established British Museum, which is the museum where we're going to start our visit. And he acquired natural history specimens, but he also bought a remarkable group of portrait busts made by fellow Huguenot sculptor Louis-Francois Roubiliac at the sale after Roubiliac's death in 1762. And Maty was also a champion of inoculation against smallpox, which of course had been developed earlier in the 18th century and was of course then a killer. So he played a very important part in medical provision in London. So we're going to go from the British Museum for a walk through Soho, which is an area in West London where many Huguenot craftsmen settled. And we will start at the library of the French Protestant Church in Soho Square, which is the church that succeeded the original Huguenot church in Threadneedle Street that was founded in 1550 by the boy king Protestant Edward VI. Amazingly, the library of that Threadneedle Street church survives and has been rehoused in this late 19th century church building in Soho Square. And I'm showing you a detail of the signature for Claude Bosanquet, a leading Huguenot family who were very generous. In fact, they paid for the new church in Fournier Street in the heart of Spitalfields, which we will see on a later day. And you can see also the coat of arms of the Bosanquet family on the left, not entirely politically correct. In fact, the Huguenot Museum in Rochester is planning to display a slave collar, which is inscribed Bosanquet, which is currently in the collections at the National Maritime Museum, because we need to explain that some Huguenot plantation owners and merchants resident in the British Isles employed in slaves on their estates. As we walk through Soho, we will discover how craftsmen worked. And this is an early 19th century sketch showing the young British artist William Hogarth, who trained as an engraver on silver. So we've already seen the coat of arms on that dish that was made for the Duke of Devonshire. And Hogarth actually specialized in engraving coats of arms, which you can probably imagine was quite a demanding level of detail. And you can see him here. I mean, he's an apprentice, so he's probably in his mid-teens. And the silver that he's working on is being brought for his attention by an even younger apprentice. And notice the way that he's working underneath a window with a muslin screen in order to even out the light so that he can really focus on what he's doing. William Hogarth was apprenticed to Ellis Gamble, who worked with Paul de Lamery, perhaps one of the most famous Huguenot goldsmiths to work in London in the 18th century. It's characteristic of 18th century London that such advertisements or trade cards, as we're looking at here, are translated into French as well as English. French was the fashionable language at court in London at the time. So we believe that Hogarth actually designed this trade card for his master. Ellis Gamble worked at the sign of the Golden Angel. So imagine walking through the streets of Soho in the early 18th century, you would have found the shop you were looking for by the trade sign hanging above the entrance. The streets were not numbered at that time. So just to orientate yourself, this is an extraordinary map of London engraved by the Huguenot cartographer John Roke. And you can see almost in the center, St. Paul's Cathedral. And remember that Threadneedle Street, just north of St. Paul's, was where the first Huguenot church was founded in the mid-16th century. So when 150 years later, some 50,000 Huguenot refugees left France, of which some 25,000 settled in London, they settled all over the metropolis. Many of them settled in the city where the Threadneedle Street Church had been rebuilt after the Great Fire of London. They settled to the east of the city in Spitalfields, where we'll be spending a whole day. And they settled to the west of the city in Covent Garden and Soho. And the very sophisticated craftsmen settled closer to the court at St. James's, where they could be sure to attract patronage from leading members of the court and even the royal family. I particularly like this trade card for Peze Pilo, who worked at the sign of the Golden Cup in Chandos Street, just under the shadow of the Church of St. Martin in the Fields, which still stands today. Mr. Pilo specialized in making false teeth as well as making silver. And his false teeth, he claimed, were in no ways discernible from natural ones. So we imagine he was probably using walrus ivory and setting ivories in a gold or silver setting. Stephen Rambo, of Huguenot descent, made musical clocks. And this wonderful portrait is by a German artist working in London, Johann Zoffany. Rambo was working in the area known as Seven Dials, which is between Soho and Covent Garden. And we will certainly walk those streets en route from the British Museum to Soho. And then we're going to go to the V&A, and Alice Minter, who's curator of the Goldsmiths Company, has offered us a special handling session so we can actually look at some of the wonderful treasures that form that remarkable collection. Of course, Arthur Gilbert was based in California, in Los Angeles, and the collection was originally displayed at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. He was encouraged to bring his collection over to London by the late Lord Rothschild, and it was displayed in Somerset House before it moved in 2009 to the V&A, and I was closely involved in that move. So here is a spectacular wine fountain by Pierre Platel, who was the master to Paul de Lamery. And it's called a wine fountain, but actually it contained water, and the water was used to rinse the glasses, which were then refilled with wine, presented to diners who would be expected to raise a glass to their host and probably drain the glass at one fell swoop. So you can imagine they got through quite a lot of wine. Interestingly, it was a present from Queen Anne to Sir John Walter, who was responsible for the wine that was drunk at Queen Anne's royal palaces. And after the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, he campaigned to repeal what had been a prohibition on importing French wine. So interestingly, Pierre Harache was selling wine from the basement underneath his workshop. And we think he must have been importing it illegally, because at the time that it was advertised, we were at war with France. Complicated politics. In the V&A, we'll see this rather wonderful portrait of Paul Crespin, another Huguenot goldsmith, Paul de Lamery's contemporary. And the portrait had actually descended in the family of his daughter, who married a clockmaker called Francis Barrow. And it was preserved in New Zealand. In fact, I think there's a Barrow clock at Middleton Place. However, we brought it back from New Zealand in 1985 for an exhibition that I arranged at the Museum of London. And then the family decided to sell it, and I was thrilled that the V&A bought it, what is now 40 years ago. And this is a spectacular silver gilt dish made by Paul Crespin for probably originally the Duke of Chandos, who was one of the most well-funded patrons in the 1720s. And then it passed to the Dukes of Buckingham at Stowe, which is a great house outside Oxford. Some of the pieces we'll look at actually belonged to Huguenots. So this wonderful kettle and stand was made for Sir John Le Quen, who was a director of the French hospital, which we are going to visit later in the week. But do note the way in which the little putto is pointing to the coat of arms, which reminds anybody enjoying tea in the family drawing room of the status of their host. Very important. Equally, Paul de Lamery sometimes customized designs for a particular patron. So this is one of a set of 4 candlesticks made for the Huguenot Lee Hupp family. That's how the name is pronounced in English. And if you look closely, you can see that in the center of the stem of the candlestick, there is a bee skep or beehive. And that is because these candlesticks were commissioned by the family who had bees and beehives on their coat of arms. So in the French hospital, you will see the remarkable representation of the coat of arms of the Lee Hupp family. And on the left, a portrait of Peter Lee Hupp, who in fact was involved in the lottery to raise funds for the new British Museum in 1753. He was a banker. He lived in Mayfair, fashionable Mayfair, but unfortunately, he had his hand in the till and was accused of fraud and dismissed from his role in masterminding the lottery for the British Museum. So unfortunately, not all Huguenots were as sober and hardworking and trustworthy as we would like to believe. Paul de Lamery had a busy workshop with apprentices, and one of the apprentices was the son of a Huguenot vicar who was based in Derbyshire. Abraham Portal really wanted to write poetry and plays, and he wrote to his brother, who was living in Geneva, to explain how difficult it was to concentrate on writing with the very noisy atmosphere in the workshop of Paul de Lamery. Nevertheless, he made some beautiful silver when he became free and a master of the goldsmith's craft. And this is a set of communion plate that was made for the Asylum for Female Orphans, a charitable foundation established in London in the 1750s. And the plate was commissioned by a leading city merchant, Sir Thomas Hankey. So we'll see that in the Sacred Silver and Stained Glass Gallery on display in the V&A. Well, in Soho, we are going into the French church, and we will get a chance to see the library that was originally part of the Threadneedle Street Church. There's a very intriguing portrait hanging in the library, which has not yet been identified, but we think it might be a member of the Bosanquet family. Apparently, according to the family today, the sitter has a Bosanquet nose, which is still identifiable in male members of the family to this day. There's also a remarkable long case clock by Francis Perigal, a family who came originally from Dieppe in Normandy. And this was given to the French church, then in Threadneedle Street, in 1743. And the date is inscribed on the dial, as well as the signature of the maker. And very recently, this has been put back into working order. So we will hear it chime when we visit the library. We have a whole day in Rochester at the Huguenot Museum, which you see on the left of the screen. And on the right, the spectacular doll's house that was given to a Huguenot teenager, Sarah Letuyer, and has been preserved by the National Trust at Up Park near Petersfield in West Sussex, which was the estate that Sarah acquired when she married Sir Matthew Featherstone in 1746. She was given this doll's house as a teenager, and the intention was that it would teach her how to manage a great house, how to instruct the servant. So there are 12 dolls, and the dolls representing the family who own the house are made in wax, and the servants are made in wood. The footmen are wearing the livery of Sarah's maiden family, the Letuyers. The coat of arms included 3 parrots, 3 green parrots. And so the footman's coats are green. And in the drawing room, which is the room in the middle story on the left, you can see silver sconces that carried real beeswax candles with which the doll's house was originally lit. Of course, now it's lit by electricity. Each of those sconces is engraved with Sarah's coat of arms. So very interestingly, although this became an heirloom in the family into which she married, it remains her doll's house, and I think added her presence to the interiors at Up Park. So we have this on loan for at least another year, and it's attracting a lot of interest. It's one of the great doll's houses of the world, and there are some 700 fixtures and fittings, including these very spectacular 4 state beds, in one of which the lady of the house is just recovering from childbirth, while at the foot of the bed, the wet nurse looks after her son and the wet nurse's own son. So there's a wonderful theme of upstairs, downstairs, the way in which the servants relate to the family who live in the house. I apprise if you recognize the distinguished politician who's standing in front of the doll's house here. It's Dominic Grieve, who is the president of the Franco-British Society in the British Isles, but had a very high profile previous to the last election in Parliament here at Westminster. So we will also be visiting the French Hospital, which a remarkable foundation, originally through a bequest from one Jacques de Gattigny, who was William III's master of buckhounds. So he looked after that king's hunting interest. He left £1,000 in his will to provide shelter for Huguenot refugees who could no longer earn a living, or who were suffering from trauma because of the way in which they'd been persecuted in France by Catholic soldiers who were billeted on the population. So there was a distribution of royal bounty from collections across the country. And we're looking here at the original French hospital building that was constructed in 1718, the year in which the charity received a royal charter from the first of the Hanoverian monarchs, King George I. They even used a Huguenot contractor for building the institution. And one of the wings, I think probably the wing on the left, was known as the Petite Maison and provided special care and shelter for those with mental health needs. And the Huguenots were ahead of the game, really, in recognizing the problems of post-traumatic stress disorder through the trauma that many had experienced for their faith in France. We will also see evidence for the charity school that was established in Westminster, rather later actually, in the 1740s, by David Hubert, a master clockmaker. And the Huguenot Museum has a nice little portrait of David Hubert, which apparently hung in the committee room at the French school, which was off Tottenham Court Road, just north of Oxford Street. If you supported the school and you were encouraged to subscribe 12 shillings a year, you would receive a receipt which had been designed by the son of another clockmaker, Charles Grignon. And you can see that the same receipt continued to be used through the 19th century. And in fact, the school survived through to 1924, when it only educated girls. But to begin with, it was girls and boys. So you see that the receipt form has been customized to reflect the single-sex education by the 19th century. Recently, we were given these remarkable portraits of Anne Courtauld, the daughter of Augustine, who was the second generation of that very famous Huguenot family, who of course founded the Courtauld Institute of Art, the Courtauld Gallery in London, which we will also visit. But she married the gentleman on the right, Jean Jacob, Huguenot goldsmith from Metz. He was forced to give up being an apprentice goldsmith in his hometown because he was caught trying to communicate with his sister, who had been confined to a convent in order to force her conversion to Protestantism. He moved to Paris and managed to pick up an apprenticeship there. And then apparently an English lady patron discovered his story and said, why didn't he come to London? And he initially worked for one of the royal goldsmiths of Huguenot origin, married his master's daughter. His first wife died after childbirth, and he then married Anne Courtauld. What is interesting about these portraits is they are painted in their maturity, which is quite rare. And it's also sobering to remember that both Anne and Jean wrote their wills in French. This is in the 1780s, 1790s. And in fact, Anne's sister-in-law, Louisa Perrina Auger, is part of a silk weaving family, used to speak to her grandchildren in French to ensure that their knowledge of their language of heritage survived. So we're going to go after the French Hospital and the Huguenot Museum to one of the great houses in the southeast of England. This is Knowle, originally built as a palace for the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's known as a calendar house. There are apparently 365 windows and 7 courtyards. Spectacular interiors, including upholstered furniture and wonderful portraits. So I'm very excited that we will have the opportunity to see this great house. And there are items of Huguenot interest as well. There's some rather splendid decorative painting by a member of the Hauduroy family, which we will have a chance to see. And then we're going to go to Boughton House near Kettering for the day, which is another remarkable calendar house, 365 windows and 7 courtyards. Here we're looking at the great late 17th century wing, which was added by Ralph Montague. He became Duke of Montague in the reign of Queen Anne. But as Ralph Montague, he had been Charles II's ambassador to the court of Louis XIV at Versailles. So he really learnt about buildings and patronage from the Sun King himself. But he was an ardent Protestant, and he encouraged some of the Protestant artists and craftsmen that he met in Paris to come over to London to decorate his home. He lived at Montague House, Bloomsbury, which accommodated the first British Museum, and inherited this great house, Boughton, near Kettering. So this is just a taster of the remarkable interiors at Boughton. A state bed, which maybe was made in France and brought back in the diplomatic bag by Ralph Montague in the 1670s. It was refurbished and sent from London to Boughton in the early years of the 18th century. And if you look up above the bed, you will see this painted ceiling of Mars, the god of war, with Venus being caught by Vulcan in a net. So I'm not sure whether you can see that detail. But rather remarkably, as you walk into the state bedroom, Venus appears to be sitting up. And as you walk through, she appears to be lying down. So it's a kind of very clever trick that the artist has achieved. And the artist is Louis Charon, a Huguenot artist who was trained at the French Academy of Painting and Sculpture, who won the Prix de Rome, so he trained in Rome as well. And in 1693, he decided to return to his father's faith. His mother was Catholic, his father was Protestant, and to come, I think, with the Duke of Montague's encouragement to London. And he attended the church in the Savoy near the Strand, which had been given by Charles II to encourage Huguenots to follow the Anglican liturgy translated into French, whereas many of the churches in the East End followed the Calvinist liturgy also in French. So we're going to spend a whole day in Spitalfields. I'm sure many of you are aware of the extraordinary house furnished by American Dennis Sievers in Folgate Street. But very excitingly, in the last couple of months, the Spitalfields Trust, who've done so much to restore Huguenot Spitalfields and the great weavers' houses, have taken back 19 Princelet Street. These are photographs for an article that was published in our Financial Times in August. And you can see the entrance to 19 Princelet Street in the center. The house was lived in by the Auger family. They were leading silk weavers, and we will see a portrait of Pierre Auger in the Huguenot Museum. Fascinatingly, in the 1870s, over the garden at the back, a synagogue was built to welcome the many Jews who came and settled in the East End of London. So we are in for an extraordinary opportunity to look in detail at some remarkable treasures, both architecture and objects and portraits and archives, which will, I hope, bring to life some aspect of the Huguenot contribution to British culture. Of course, one of the most remarkable things about the Huguenot diaspora was the international network that they established. And so I am particularly thrilled at this opportunity to introduce members of the Huguenot Society of South Carolina to what we have to offer to match the extraordinary preservation that you have achieved in the great city of Charleston. Thank you so much for this opportunity to give you a taster of some of what is to come on the projected visit in May 2025.